Appreciate the introduction, Harold, and just a little bit more on my background. I've been a CCA since I think around 1996. 09418 is my number, so below the 10,000s as far as getting my CCA entrance and introduction. And then a few years ago, became a certified professional agronomist, which is kind of an extension of the CCA program. So um, appreciate the opportunity today to share with you a little pest management stuff. Reality is, on a daily basis, I do a lot of things in relationship to nutrient management and Lake Erie in particular, but some of the water quality issues in the state of Ohio. So don't get to talk about some of the other issues in agronomy as much as I did when I was working in Fulton County for 25 years as a county educator. So it's been good to have this annual opportunity to talk a little bit about pest management, which is an area that I really do enjoy working in. It's a slide, and when we talk about insects, really the type of injuries or things that make insects a pest are removing photosynthetic area by feeding. They can transmit disease to from their mouth parts to the plant. Some things like barley yellow dwarf come from the mouth parts of an aphid transmitted to the wheat plant. They damage protective layers. They may take off just the waxy layer of the leaf. They may bore into the stalk, opening it up to diseases and other types of destruction later in the life cycle. By their mouth parts, they may just suck on the plant in essence and consume sugars out of the plants that would otherwise go to forming new leaves and ultimately forming grain on a grain crop. Some of the beetles can be toxic, and that might be their presence in hay as hay is harvested. So there are toxins that might be associated with insects. And once again, they can host disease as a part of the life cycle or the um, process of maintaining in the environment a disease. They may be a host that actually in their mouth parts, they maintain the disease for a portion of their life cycle. So insects kind of become a pest and do damage in those ways to our crop management of. Here's some soybean insects, a similar type of page here that we can find in the guide, and I don't have it turned. Let's see. On page 93, you can actually find this scouting guide. Gives you that, where do we look in relationship to these different insect pests. Seed corn maggot comes up again, really a similar type of situation as what we have in corn. Slugs would also be a common soybean pest and similar situation. These would be, this would be a description, more up close look of soybean aphid, really to identify aphid from other organisms you might find that look similar at the same time as the two tailpipes that you see here. Those would be the identifying factors that you'll find. Actually, late in the season, you'll see this where you have sooty molds growing on the upper surface of the leaf. And typically the place to best look for soybean aphid if you're out scouting is actually the underside of the leaf and near the growing point, as you see here. They'll populate this area and then they'll start to, as there's no more room, in essence, they'll start to move down lower in the plant or move out into other nearby plants to continue their growth and life cycle. Spider mites. That would be the other organism, and you can see pretty, quick look, you can see easily how you might mistake them for a soybean aphid here, but these have the two spotted spider mites here. You see the two spots, particularly here on these little less advanced nymphs feeding out there. You can see the eggs on the leaf. And what you see here is you'll see 6 distinct or 8 distinct legs on spider mite. And what you'll notice then, no tailpipe coming off. These are not tailpipes, these are actually legs on that, and a spider mite actually has 8 legs to it. You'll see the damage typically on an edge of field like this, and the conditions that you'll see that is a summer where it's hot and dry. So sometimes if we catch it early enough, we can actually just make a treatment on the edge of the field, and do further observation to see if we had missed them and they had moved out further before we made that edge treatment. You'll see this kind of wrinkly appearance to the leaves as they're feeding. Turn them over, and once again you'll find them on the back side. Here you see the vein of the leaf. This is insecticides and foliar treatments. The one thing that I ought to say at this point is it's going to take, because it is a mite, it is a different type of organism, it does require a miticide type of product, or at least an activity on mites that would be a miticide. And when you look at the range of foliar insecticides that we have for soybean aphid and other insects on soybeans, not all of them will control spider mites. So we do need to be much more selective if we have both spider mites and soybean aphid in a field, or if we have just spider mites alone out there in the field. And they can be present at the same time depending on the season. We're going to talk for just a minute about soybean defoliation, and this is one of those areas that helps illustrate the different stages of growth. We can have different thresholds on it. In the seedling stage, we're looking at 40% toleration of feeding. Once we get into the bloom stage and up to pod fill, 15% is what we set as a toleration threshold for that, or the action threshold for that. When we get into pod fill, we can start to see an increase where we can accept a little more pod feeding because we're more advanced in growth stage here. So, when we look at, we don't even have 40% on this guide, but 40% over a wide area of the field is pretty heavy feeding, as you can see. And, when we talk about these thresholds, we're not talking about a single leaf on the top of the plant reaching 40%. We're talking about seeing throughout the upper part of the canopy widespread appearance of leaves that would have damage greater than this. Here's our 15% where we're talking about bloom and talking about management there. And that, I won't look up the page, but this chart and the materials is in the field guide a couple pages back from where we were looking on page 93. White grub can also be out there, and really we're not going to see the grub stage. I should have done this a little differently, but what you'll see on soybeans is typically what you see here as far as leaf feeding. And what you'll experience is them congregated, as you see them here, on a few leaves on the upper part of the canopy, but really the rest of the plant not showing any damage or injury at all. So, they can be misleading in relationship to whether we need to feed them or need to control them. The thing that you will experience is that in addition to Japanese beetle, you may have bean leaf beetle, you may have grasshoppers, you may have other insects that are out there feeding and causing further damage. And that's why we use that threshold of 40% for injury, and it can be from a combination of Japanese beetle, bean leaf beetle, and grasshoppers, or it could be any of those organisms individually out there causing that type of injury level. And this is bean leaf beetle. Bean leaf beetle, a very common insect for us to find throughout the season. We'll see it early season in an adult stage, which is the overwintering stage. We'll go through a larval stage, and then we'll see them as a second generation. And you'll see this kind of feeding out in the field where they're removing leaf tissue. The key characteristic for identifying bean leaf beetle, because both of these, whether they have spots, the 4 spots, or no spots on them, and they can be different color patterns of oranges and yellows, as you see here, oranges, yellows, and browns. What you'll notice is the behind the head, the triangle, and that triangle is the very distinctive identification that we have for bean leaf beetle, regardless of what these color and spot patterns are on that particular insect. Another one to look at is Mexican bean beetle. I've never seen them in Northwest Ohio. I've seen them a couple times in Southern Ohio. But basically, once again, it's a organism that has a complete life cycle. You have the eggs, the nymphs, and the pupa, or larval stages, I should say here, the pupa, and then the adult. You could easily mistake this organism, although it's much bigger than a lady beetle, convergent lady beetle out in the field, but you can see where it has some similarities. So you do need to be taking a look at that, but you'll actually see where they're feeding on the plant versus feeding on the spider mites or a soybean aphid that might be out in the field. And you'll see this kind of damage when we talk about Mexican bean leaf beetle. Once again, those same economic thresholds that we see for defoliation, scouting and foliar spray applications are what we use as far as control here. One thing that we do need to be aware of in soybeans, it's somewhat similar to our ear feeding on corn, is that we can have pod feeding. And these are normal seeds. You don't see any injury scars on the pods themselves. Here you start to see some injury points in relationship to feeding. Basically, the insect scrapes off the outer surface, leaving a thin film. That opens up the pod to different decaying organisms, and you'll end up with seed with that type of injury here, as you see down below, where your normal seed are here on the left-hand side. So pod feeding has been something that we've become more aware of and more concerned about. It is really two organisms that we're primarily looking at. Soybean bean leaf beetle do that pod feeding. Actually, this would be injury that I took some pictures of in Fulton County, where we had bean leaf beetle feeding late in the season out in the field. So we're looking with bean leaf beetle of 10 to 15% of the pods having injury, and the bean leaf beetle are still present and actively feeding. The other organism that can do the same type of injury is stink bugs that we've seen more prevalent in the state. Here's a couple of the major ones that we see out there in the field. In fact, there's a good guide that I should have put a link to here that you can get that helps differentiate all of the stink bugs that we have here in the state. Regardless, really we use here not the feeding level, but a sweep net. And depending on whether we're working with food grade type of soybeans or tofu uses, we have a lower tolerance of only 2 of the stink bugs per sweep, or 10 sweeps that we're using as a threshold, versus standard grain, a little more tolerant and up to 4 per 10 sweep sets. Scouting and insecticides are really our best bet at this point, because any early season applications would have long not been effective for stink bugs.
Greg, we have a question in the chat box.
Yep.
Brittany asks, how can you distinguish the difference between Mexican bean beetle and Japanese beetle feeding on leaves if there are no insects present on the plant at the time of scouting?
Good question, because the injury will look very similar. I can't imagine that you won't find the adults. You may have to dig for them. Reality is, if you're out there and the damage has occurred and you can't find any more insects, it really doesn't matter what it was that caused the injury, because we're not going to do any control at that point, because spraying damaged foliage after the insect is gone is not going to give us any economic benefit. So I would look at it that way. Certainly you should be able to find the insects there if they're active still and causing injury. That's going to give you the way to identify them. If they're not present, that's a good point for knowing that you won't know what the injury was caused by, so it leaves you a little bit concerned there. But at least what you'll know at that point, it wasn't worth doing any application if the insects aren't